All right, good evening. I just want to welcome you all to Nigeria, Conflict and the Environment. My name is Katie Furrow. I work with the Church of the Brethren's Office of Public Witness and the Global Food Crisis Fund. Tonight's webinar is hosted by the Office of Public Witness as part of our Going to the Garden program, which is a way to address food insecurity in our own communities while also looking at issues of creation care. Our format tonight is going to let us hear from both Nate and Kate, and then Nate is going to wrap us up with a theological follow-up, and then after that, we'll open up to any questions or comments that you all listening in might have. I'd like to take a minute to just introduce our presenters. Nathan Hostler is the director of the Church of the Brethren's Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C., and is a minister at the Washington City Church of the Brethren. He previously worked with the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria for 2 years, teaching peacebuilding theology and practice. Kate Edelen is a research associate at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, where she conducts research and analysis at the nexus of peacebuilding, environment, and counterterrorism policy, with special focus on Africa. Previously, Edelen was a Fulbright Fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo in Norway, where she conducted research on the relationship between political violence and climatologically-affected water resources in South Asia. So in just a minute, I will pass it over to them. I also want to just do a quick reminder that if anyone is interested in receiving continuing education units for this, there will be some information at the end of the webinar about how you can go about doing that. Otherwise, I would just like to thank Nate and Kate for being here, and I'll pass it over to them.
Great, thank you, Katie. I'll start off for a little bit, and then Kate will go, and then I'll come back at the end. So as was sort of alluded to in the introduction, before coming to DC, I worked with my wife Jen, and I worked in northeastern Nigeria with the Church of the Brethren there, and I'll explain a little where that is in a moment. While we worked there, we worked with Ecclesia Yanoa Nigeria, or EYN, the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria. The center and highest concentration of EYN is in the northeastern part of Nigeria, in Adamawa and Borno states, which is bordered by Cameroon to the east and Niger and Chad to the north. This webinar will take a look at the relation between the environment and conflict in Nigeria, with particular focus on these northern regions. Kate will go into greater detail on the relationship between environmental degradation and climate change and conflict, but I'll start us off with a few observations and cases that I saw while working in Nigeria relating to these linkages of the environment and conflict, and how I heard Nigerians and EYN folks talk about this sometimes. During our time in Nigeria, Jen and I engaged in various components of peace building, or primarily around Cult Bible College near Mubi in Adamawa State. The area around KBC, Cult Bible College, was mostly farmland with a little bit of bush, this sort of low, scrubby trees and plants. All of the students and people in the surrounding village of Kwarhi farmed, most subsistence alongside of other jobs. There's also nomadic and semi-nomadic cattle herders nearby. These herders, ethnically Fulani, would travel across all of West and Central Africa, grazing their cattle. So there was a small Fulani village inside of the campus, called Bible College campus, that is. Many people from this village would travel north during rainy season and then come back south during the dry season. As dry season would set in the fall, in our fall, dry season would come, farmers would begin to harvest their crops. As dry season would set in, they would harvest these crops, and around the same time, the herders would begin to return. Once the crops were harvested, the cattle would be let back across the fields to clean up the leftover stalks and leaves. However, as over the years the desert continued to move further south and the population of farmers continued to grow, it became increasingly common for cattle to enter the fields and graze before farmers had finished their work. This was primarily due to increased demands of land, and also reduced land, but it also meant that farmers would often extend their farm areas into places where would extend their farm grazing areas into areas that typically have been kept open for sort of corridors for the cattle to pass through. One time, while working at Bible College, I set up a weekend training for mediation with Bible College students in a peace club. This was a training outside of the normal, regular peacebuilding classes I was teaching. At one point during the day, I broke the group of maybe 20 to 30 students up into 4 groups to develop and present role-play scenarios around a specific conflict. And they had to choose their conflict and show how they could resolve it. As the groups acted out their scenarios, one student, Reverend Ayuba, observed that 3 out of 4 of the conflicts acted out were around issues of land usage and ownership. In fact, it was near this time that the son of the librarian at the school was cut by a machete while trying to chase cattle out of the field. Now, these students had focused on this type of conflict, even though the conflict in Jos was continuous, was very continuous at this point. Boko Haram was beginning its comeback. The election violence was fairly recent at this time, and armed robbery was beginning to be quite regular in a nearby city. Another time, there was an interfaith conference on religion and climate change in the state capital of Yola, hosted by another group at a college there. I was asked to present a paper and also help the EYN Peace Coordinator and Provost of Bible College with his paper. After I presented, someone in the audience asked the question about, which is very common in international gatherings on climate change. It went something like this. Since the U.S. and European countries got rich on industry that was heavily reliant on fossil fuels and rampant pollution, shouldn't they be the ones that pay the primary cost and sacrifice in order to address climate change? While I won't get into this discussion right now, it does raise critical issues about how we address poverty while building peace and also seeking to care for the environment. And how do these happen inside of particular communities and countries and also between countries? While noting several things in response, namely that, I believe it is maybe our primary responsibility. To this question, I observed to the group or observed myself that once people start leaving their homes to travel to conferences on things like climate change and leave their farming tools or hand farming tools behind, once they get to this point of traveling for such things, they're probably shifting into greater consumption, which also means they're greater contributing to this problem. This doesn't, of course, mean that everyone should go back to farming with hand tools, but it does show that there's a level of connection between this attempt to modernize and greater economic growth and more use of energy. Looking into a few of those more detailed ways of this connection between conflict and environment, I'll ask Kate Edelen to come back on, and she will have a slideshow, I believe, as well. So Kate, to you.
Hi there. Sorry, it seems that I have a bad connection, so I'm going to keep my camera off for the moment, but I'll put up this PowerPoint and start giving my presentation. So just to clarify, just as Katie mentioned, my name is Kate Edelen, and I'm a research associate at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, where I work on issues at the nexus of environmental peacebuilding and conflict and security and U.S. counterterrorism policy. And back in July, I had the opportunity to travel to Nigeria, and I traveled all throughout the country, meeting with different peacebuilders and understanding the conflict dynamics in the different regions. That relates to the geography and the culture and some of the different conflict dynamics within these little microcosms of almost completely different countries in some senses. And so that will be culminated in a report coming out almost, I believe, in June. But for now, I will turn to talking about conflict in the environment as it relates to Nigeria and see if I can get this slide going for you all. All right. So I really wanted to start off this conversation to provide some understanding about what the research community does know about the connection between climate and conflict. If we can get the slide to go. There we go. And so we really know three things at this point. And the first thing is that we don't necessarily have a scientific consensus on the robustness of the relationship between climate and conflict. And this really is for two reasons. You've got people who are studying this relationship from very different kind of positions. And I think the first is that of this large quantitative global trend study that are using kind of regression analysis and looking at the relationship that way. And this kind of has the challenge in this type of procedure or methodology is that you have the issue where you're running into lack of data, whether it be at the local level related to events, conflict events, or that of environmental data. But then you also have the flip side of the coin, people that are doing case studies that actually do find a connection between climate and conflict. They have very local aggregated data and can actually point to specific conflicts that are kind of affected by climate. And so the important thing to kind of draw from this conclusion is that there is no single cause of conflict, and while attributing climate as a direct cause of conflict is not correct, it is likewise unproductive to disregard climate change's impact on climate and violence. And the countries that are considered the most at risk of instability and conflict as a consequence of climate change are those already marked by important conflict-promoting features such as poverty and poor governance, social inequality, large populations with politically marginalized subgroups. And so what we need to do really is then to move past this impasse where we're kind of arguing over whether climate is the direct cause of conflict, is kind of to look at how climate change impacts may affect or interact with non-climate factors such as identity and social patterns, livelihoods, institutional performance, and whether those interactions are likely to generate or contribute to the potential for conflict in specific countries or contexts. And so the second point that I can talk about the climate conflict connection is that climate-associated conflict has an inverse relationship with geography. You're probably asking, what do I mean by that? So recent studies suggest that conflict associated with climate change manifests as intercommunal and local conflict, not so much these large-scale international wars over shared resources between countries, but rather they often occur within countries, and these countries often suffer from weak environmental protection framework, socioeconomic and political inequality, and poor recognition of water and land rights. And again, these are all factors that kind of add to the exacerbation of conflict. And then thirdly, institutions, they be formal or informal, really are important. So if you study the influence of institutions and how they manage resources and conflicts, you find that conflicts over resources really break out when the ability to adapt to pressures, whether they be economic or environmental, are surpassed by the acute scarcity of the resource. So when institutions have conflict mitigation mechanisms in place prior environmental or economic shocks, there's a greater likelihood that the conflict will be resolved. Secondly, you have increased resource competition, which may inspire opportunism and ideological radicalization, building on extant social cleavages, notably ethnic identities. And so this is what you potentially have happening in the Northeast, where you have actors that are acting on perceived grievances against the state and are radicalized because of heavy-handed military responses. Then thirdly, you have reduced state income from agricultural underperformance, which hinders the delivery of these public goods, reduces political legitimacy, and can give rise to political challengers. And in the case of Nigeria, this includes the oil sector as it suffers from corruption and quote-unquote missing revenue. And for those of you that follow this in the news, every few years or so, Nigeria reports about 20 billion, 40 billion, 4 billion missing in revenue. And this really not only robs the state of revenue to promote socioeconomic development in the way of infrastructure and education, but it also delegitimizes the state in the eyes of the public, creating dissent and grievance. So fourth, you have efforts to adapt to a changing environment or to remove the cause of global warming can actually have an inadvertent side effect that could cause stimulate tension and conflict. And this kind of seems counterintuitive, but this happens when you have certain people that benefit from interventions. And these usually are elites, people that are well educated, people that are politically engaged. And so you again have a situation where you're adding to the burdens of the marginalized. And then finally, you have a deteriorating environmental conditions, which can force people to migrate in large numbers, thereby increasing environmental stress in the receiving areas and increase the potential for radicalization and ethnic hatreds within the displaced, as well as the host populations. And so this is what you really see happening kind of in the south as people move out of the arid north and out of the rural areas. So now we'll finally move to Nigeria. So let me just give a broad kind of snapshot of Nigeria before we kind of delve into some of the environmental aspects of the crisis. So things that are really important to understand is Nigeria is a massive country. It's the size of 2 Californias, and it has a population of 150 million people. And for those of you who are kind of wondering how many people are in California, there's just south of 40 million people. So while Nigeria is extremely huge, it's also extremely densely populated. It also is Africa's largest economy, just surpassed South Africa this year. However, it suffers from extreme economic inequality and is actually projected to overtake India this year with the largest population of people living in poverty. It also is the second in the world for internally displaced peoples with 33 million people. Colombia is first, and most of you would probably think that IDPs are a result of the conflict, but the majority of them actually come from floods in the north and the middle belts. Nigeria is also extremely diverse, both ethnically with 350 ethnic groups, as well as climatologically and geographically. I should mention that they have extreme differences from north to south. And if you look at Nigeria, there are kind of 3 broad ecological zones, which are commonly distinguished within the country, and that's the northern Sudan, and then you've got the middle belt, which is where the north and the south meet, and so you've kind of got a mixed landscape of Edelen and desert, and then it kind of turns into, and then you've got the southern rainforest, which is quite wet. But on the whole, there's actually 8 distinct agroecological areas, so that's a lot of diversity of how you address different kind of management of different resources that adds to the burden. So just to give you an understanding of how important natural resources are to Nigeria and its economy, as well as its people's livelihoods, renewable resources, which are water and land, make up about 21% of Nigeria's GDP, with 23% of that being from jobs. And in the Delta, this is even higher, with about 40% of employment coming from agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors. And then, of course, water is extremely important in Nigeria, and 69% of all water withdrawals goes to agriculture. So very thirsty agricultural sector that Nigeria has. Then we have the high-value natural resources. This is oil, minerals, diamonds, gold, uranium, tin. They don't have diamonds. But the oil revenues account for about 90% of total exports and about 70% of government revenues. This creates the situation where you've got a monolithic economy and are very vulnerable to economic shocks, whether within the oil market. And this is what we saw right before the elections. There was a huge dip in oil prices, and this caused a lot of concern that this would have really horrible repercussions not only on Nigeria's economy, but also on how, if they were going to be able to kind of mitigate violence and some of the resources that they would be able to have, that they would have at their disposal to mitigate that violence. And of course, environmental degradation is hugely debilitating to economies and countries that are extremely reliant on natural resources and raw natural resources. The World Bank estimated that Nigeria loses annually about 5 to 10% of its GDP from environmental degradation alone. So very costly. So just to talk a bit about, now you're probably wondering all these different environmental issues within Nigeria. Given that it is extremely diverse, it has a lot of different types of landscape and geography and climatology, and so therefore it has various environmental issues that it suffers from. And within Nigeria, you really have a dichotomous situation occurring where certain regions have too much water and others have too little. But other kind of broader environmental issues include sea level rise, urbanization, climate-driven migration, desertification, which leads to food insecurity. We talked a little bit about oil revenue already. In the Delta, oil spills and pollution have led to decreased land productivity and polluted waters. And then you also have the situation of creating parallel shadow economies where young men and women are siphoning oil. And of course, instability is fueled by economic opportunities. Corruption also, again, plays a huge part in public dissent and grievance. And unfortunately, Nigeria is no stranger to that. So I'll just kind of go into more detail about the specific environmental issues and where they are kind of based within the country itself. If you start off on the far left in the south there, you will come across the city of Lagos. Lagos is Nigeria's coastal economic hub, and it is massive. It is one of Africa's largest megacities, but it was also listed by the IPCC as one of the megacities at risk for sea level rise. And this is further complicated by the city's extremely fast-growing population, which is now more than 21 million people. And Lagos really suffers from the challenge of drainage, as floods and storm surges have produced fatalities and exposed many to waterborne diseases. Issues of sanitation and clean water are especially challenging given the growing illegal slums and increasing migrant population from the north and the rural areas. Public services have improved significantly, including a comprehensive program to deal with solid waste management. However, this has actually had an unexpected challenge kind of thrown in as the improvements have actually attracted migrants. So public works institutions are trying to keep pace with this massive human impact and are finding it extremely challenging. And also migrants from the drought-stricken north and northeast are sometimes viewed with suspicion as possibly being Boko Haram sympathizers or members. And so this kind of creates an environment of rejection and hostility towards migrants, which kind of creates a new avenue of conflict. And since I mentioned the north and northeast, I'll come to some of the issues that are affecting the northeast and the north, and that includes desertification. An estimated 1,350 square miles of Nigerian land turns to desert each year, and this is farmers and herders south from the Sahel and cities. Desertification is a massive driver of food insecurity, which has forced a lot of Fulani herdsmen who are worried about unreliable weather and disease to migrate southwest and settle in search of cattle grazing areas. And of course, they're joined by migrants moving out of Niger as well, looking for better conditions. And so this kind of adds to the burden felt actually in the Middle Belt. And so now this brings me to kind of an aspect of Nigeria's Middle Belt. So in central Nigeria, you have farmer-herder conflicts. They are responsible, for instance, in 2014, the first 3 months saw about 1,000 deaths as a result of this. And farmer conflicts are not new. They've been going on for decades and decades, and probably centuries. However, the availability and access to weapons through different trade routes, through different militant kind of criminality has increased the frequency and the lethality of the violence. And so, but you also see that these effects are felt in the Northeast. A survey found, as actually Nate mentioned, but one found that the resource competition, principally over land and water, figured as the primary cause in 54% of conflicts between households or communities. And increased migration from climate change and conflict has witnessed an increase in clashes over access to land and water. And this has actually disrupted these long-standing traditional mechanisms of conflict mitigation over resources. So to give you an example, in Jos, there's the relationship between the Baram, who tend to be Christian farm, and the Fulani, who are nomadic pastoralists and usually are Muslim, but also can be animalists, have enjoyed a very long and strong relationship between their communities. They've lived together, intermarried. However, this took a turn in 2001 when hostilities broke out between Baram Christian and Hausa Muslim, who are also inhabitants of the region. And in retaliation, the Baram looked to kill basically any kind of Muslim, and they indiscriminately attacked and killed Fulani. And in response, the Fulani were particularly hurt by this, given the history between these two communities, and retaliated in really brutal fashion, killing Baram. women and men and children. And they also sent word to their larger Fulani brethren that kind of stretch, because they are pastoralists and nomadic, they stretch across these porous borders of Niger and Mali and Mauritania and even CAR. And they sent word to come and help. They said, we're being slaughtered, please come and help us. And so throughout West and Central Africa, Fulani came into Nigeria through the borders, came down into Jos and did kill some of their own, but also, with this massive influx of Fulani in the area, they also kind of put additional pressures on resources and created new conflicts within the Fulani community. And as we see, cattle rustling is becoming an extremely lucrative kind of endeavor, especially as pastoralists and agrarian livelihoods are starting to die out. And so we see this incentivization of criminality and violence. And so this kind of brings me to the Delta. And the Delta, as some of you might know, started originally as grievances among local groups wanting a greater share of oil revenue. And I should preface this with, the Delta is an extremely oil-rich and productive region of the world. It was the 5th largest importer from the U.S. And so there's been a long legacy in the 60s and the 80s of international companies coming in and extracting oil from these areas, often with the help of Nigerian elites and governments, to the detriment of local communities, to their socioeconomic development, as well as pollution of their lands with very little compensation, if any compensation. And so this conflict really, it ended up being a military kind of campaign, but it started off as grievances among local populations wanting a greater share of oil revenue, more socioeconomic development, and support of loss of livelihoods from oil spills and pollution. And pollution and oil spills have severely cut the productivity of delta lands and reduced access to arable land and water resources. And the legacy of this degradation has spurred new avenues of conflict over land between communities and has actually escalated into reoccurring violent acts, which have included bombings of houses and rape and murder. So not pleasant stuff. And after 50 years of conflict over oil drilling and heavy-handed military intervention, resistance and armed groups kind of came together in 2005 under the banner known as MEND, which is the Movement for Emancipation of Niger Delta, to coordinate attacks in an attempt to stop oil and natural gas extraction. And they were extremely successful. The government really was at a loss. They didn't know what to do. They were scared. They were losing money. International companies were pulling out. So what they decided to do then, to mitigate the violence and stop disruption of oil production, was to implement an amnesty program. So they paid combatants to come out and lay down their weapons, and they promised better socioeconomic development, and they promised trainings. However, this effort really kind of incentivized violence and created a legacy of criminal militancy, because the government sent the message that if you commit violence, we will acknowledge you and we will pay you to stop, committing violence. And so this kind of gave way to these larger groups of young men that are now mobilized by elites to create instability at crucial moments, so as they can benefit economically. And unfortunately, it's kind of giving way to a culture of criminality related to oil siphoning and other illicit trade networks. And so now I'm going to mention one last thing. And this issue is often not talked about, but it's one that I find to be extremely important. And that's Lake Chad. And it straddles Nigeria's northeast border, and it's shared with Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. And since the 1960s, it's been reduced to 1/20th of size. And this is extremely important. And as you can see, the little diagram, it shows the kind of retreat of water resources within the lake. It's shocking. It's literally almost gone. And so why is this important? Well, this lake actually supports millions of people's livelihoods, including fishing and farming. And about 50% of the decrease in the lake size since the 1960s is attributed to human water use, while the rest is attributed to climate pattern shifts. And research carried out over the past 40 years indicates that the main factors of the shrinking of this lake are related to overgrazing, which has resulted in loss of vegetation and deforestation, and contributed to a drier climate, as well as kind of larger unsustainable irrigation projects implemented by the different governments. And so these activities and climate change have actually affected an estimated 25 million people by disrupting their livelihoods. And so finally, I'll end with talking about the environmental aspects of Nigeria's insurgencies. And while we hear a lot about Boko Haram, and many people are kind of shocked to know that Nigeria is suffering from this situation, Nigeria does have a long history of secessionist movements throughout the country, and this is really a result of its diverse history, as well as a legacy of British colonial rule and kind of arbitrary borders that were assigned and forced hugely diverse ethnic groups and religions together, and also exacerbated those differences in order to rule over them. And so the crisis in Nigeria's southern delta region really exhibits similar underlying dynamics to the Boko Haram conflict in the northeast, because both are plagued with this long-standing failure to really address these root causes and a counterproductive over-reliance on military responses. And what is really striking is that development and social mobility has not really kept pace with oil revenue growth. And so most Nigerians are poorer today than they were at independence in the 1960s. And they're really a victim of poor governance and entrenched corruption. And agriculture, which was once the most important sector of Nigeria's economy, is really struggling. And in many parts of the country, the government is unable to provide adequate security, roads, health, water, power, education, things that government need to provide. And the situation is particularly dire in the far north, as I'm sure many of you are very much aware. And these frustrations and alienations kind of drive hostility against the state. And an aspect I think that is often lost in this conversation is that of the fact that many of these young men that join these insurgency groups are looking for purpose. They don't have the opportunity, they're not educated, they don't have employment, yet they seek someone who understands and appreciates them and provides reason. And so rebel and terrorist organizations promise a sense of purpose and belonging, as well as lucrative employment through these illicit trades of arms and drugs and natural resources. So opposing both these insurgencies in the north and are ultimately tied to the federal government's inability to promote inclusive, transparent economic growth and sustainable prosperity as a result of ineffective governance and corruption. And these issues will have serious repercussions as climate change continues to impact the conditions of traditional livelihoods. And I think with that, I will end, but of course I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'll continue on with a few theological reflections, and then we'll open up for some conversation. KT will be accepting questions along the sidebar. So as you finish up, you can ask questions of either Kate or myself. So when we hear of these sort of things, when we hear of the many conflicts and we hear things in the news, we often are rightfully concerned and desire to help. I think we're often also concerned that we might in some way contribute to the situation, particularly if you think in terms of discussions potentially about climate change or a range of other things. We wonder how the way of our lives, the way we go about our lives, may in some way contribute to this. And we at times feel guilty or potentially just disempowered to know what to do. While there are many things that we can do, or organizations at least that we can support, at times, at least for myself, doesn't feel like quite enough. At times we also don't know how to think about this theologically or how this relates to our faith. The next few minutes I'm going to suggest a few directions that I think might help us in thinking about this. I should note that these reflections are certainly not comprehensive, and there are many other ways we could take them. They come very, very particularly out of my own Christian and specifically Church of the Brethren theology. So I recognize that we may be a diverse audience tonight. So I hope that even though if this is not your particular tradition or space that you're coming out of, that this will be in some ways illustrative for how to potentially think about these sort of conflicts and concerns about environmental degradation. In the book of James, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7 in the New Testament, we read, "My brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a person in dirty clothes also comes in, if you take notice of the one wearing fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, and while the other one who is poor say, stand there, or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich that oppress you? Well, an undergraduate student in biblical studies, I quite expectantly was spending a great deal of time studying my Bible. I was doing this in part because I wanted to work internationally. During this time, I was also engaged with ministries with people who are homeless and refugees in Chicago. So I was reading my Bible and becoming ever more aware of poverty and violence, as well as thinking about international issues more consistently. While reading this passage in James, it struck me that in the face of globalization, that is the expanding connectedness across international borders, the poor, referred to in James, are now in effect everywhere, or everyone that is poor globally. If partiality towards rich over against poor is condemned at the community level in James, in the face of globalization, this attack on partiality is now global. So with greater knowledge and connection to the wider world comes greater responsibility. So it would seem right that we are concerned with what happens globally. It can't just be something that's over there and not affecting or connected to us. But how, a question arises for me, how do we bear the weight of holding all of this? Just because we know that there's violence and suffering or environmental degradation in Nigeria or anywhere else doesn't mean that we can effectively address this. Think of Syria or Nepal this weekend. Once a month, there's a young adult gathering at my house, mine and Jen's house, and we eat and discuss an article, a passage from the Bible, a topic related to our faith. A few months ago, the topic turned to this question: how our knowledge of the world greatly outstrips our ability to do enough, or at least feel like we can do enough, and how this can be, in fact, quite paralyzing. In the face of such violence and suffering, such as in Nigeria, our first question is often, what can we do? While I strongly affirm this desire to help, if we too quickly move to what we can do, we may, in fact, in some ways, take agency away from EYN as the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria or others. Perhaps we can learn a great deal from EYN, from how they adapt and respond to the situation. Now, please hear me. Certainly, I think we should support, as maybe mentioned at the end of this, there's the Nigeria Crisis Fund that is raising a great deal of money for assisting internally displaced persons and peacebuilding efforts. While I certainly think we should support, we can also learn a great deal about what it means for us as a church to live well in the face of violence and uncertainty. We can learn much what it means for us to be a church in the face of violence and uncertainty. One such example that comes to mind when thinking about this is of Samuel Dowdy, president of EYN. And he told Church of the Brethren staff that since many of EYN's members are refugees in Cameroon, they will plant churches there. So even while displaced, their work continues. The mission is mobile. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas, in his book Peaceful Kingdom, writes, "The church, therefore, is a polity like any other, but also unlike any other insofar as it is formed by people who have no reason to fear the truth. They are able to exist in the world without resorting to coercion to maintain their presence. That they are able to do so, that they are such, depends to a large extent on our willingness to move, for it is certain that much of the world is bound to hate them for calling attention to what the world is. They cannot and should not wish to provoke the world's violence, but if it comes, they must resist, even if that resistance means the necessity of leaving one place for another. For as Christians, we are at home in no nation. Our true home is the church itself, where we find those who, like us, have been formed by a Savior who is necessarily always on the move." End of the quote. Sorry. Earlier in this book, building off of statements as discipleship as dispossession established in the cross of Jesus and the power of God made manifest in resurrection, Hauerwas sets out to describe the kingdom of forgiveness and peace. He begins by claiming the possibility of rest. Sabbath is no longer a particular limited day, but is the shape of the possibility of rest for the people of God. In this, we see a deepening of the notions of peace as more than just the absence of violence. Rather than simply an absence of violence, it is the presence of the fullness of life. This life is made possible by Christians' confidence that their lives are in God's hands. This is not an acquiescence to the status quo, but an invitation to the confident, nonviolent action that allows us to act hopefully. Howard Ross writes, Jesus' death was not a mistake, but what is expected of a violent world which does not believe that this is God's world. In effect, Jesus is nothing less than the embodiment of God's Sabbath as a reality for all people. Jesus proclaims peace as a real alternative because he has made possible to rest, to have confidence that our lives are in God's hands. End of quote. Free from the presumption that we must control history, we are free to rest in God. Such a rest and confidence makes possible living in the presence. Samuel, as I said earlier, Samuel said that since many of EYN's members are refugees in Cameroon, they will plant churches there. They will engage in caring for others. While he's under no illusions of the suffering of EYN's people, of course, they can, in the face of this tremendous suffering, continue to act as agents, bearers of Christ's peace. Maintaining confidence in God is then not a passive acceptance of the status quo, but a maintained agency even while a victim. This is critical when we think of confidence in the work of God. Sometimes people have or have been accused of maintaining the status quo by saying trust in God. While I recognize this, that may indeed happen at times, in the case of Samuel, there's a simultaneous trust and opportunity-grabbing activeness. When we think of this situation and our faith, and we think of the church there, we have much to learn. We have also, I think, many things to offer. We will open it now for a time of questions. I'll turn back and invite Katie and Kate back on, and they will join us.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks, Kate, as well. You should, at this point, be able to see a chat bar on the side of your window if you are interested in sending in questions. So we can give a minute for that.
While people are perhaps typing, I'll ask Kate a question. In your research or in your traveling around, I'm interested to know how much of that research or that work related to or met with religious communities, and how you saw them playing into either this addressing environmental concerns or economic development or peace building or any of these other pieces.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's hard to go to Nigeria and not meet with religious groups. Everyone is religious. They don't care what you practice, but it's a form of social relations that is extremely important within Nigeria. And so the majority of organizations that I met with that focused on kind of mitigation and management of conflicts, especially in the Middle Belt, had religious roots, if not religiously oriented. And so you really saw a convening kind of space that they provided with feuding communities. There was a lot of conversations around empowerment of civilian action. You know, how do you make your government accountable, responsive, especially when you're talking about issues related to environmental degradation, as well as economic and political marginalization. And you often see, coming from a religious perspective, is this appreciation and understanding and the importance of highlighting this marginalization of subgroups that are much smaller inside and kind of holding them up to the light and requesting that the government respond. So in to answer your question, it was religious groups were very active, if not one of the most primary and largest groups that were engaged in this work.
when you talk with them, did you see them functioning kind of like as groups or organizations that were sort of religious in kind of origin, and or did they also have a strong articulation of, say, theology or spirituality while doing their work, or was it kind of like, I'm a Christian but I'm an engineer and I'm working as an engineer, or like was it very significantly theological or spiritual in their language and how they talked about this work and orientation?
Mm-hmm. That varied, I would say. There was different levels of influence from Western donors. So, of course, which can be challenging and interesting kind of space to work in for secular Western donors. But then you had both, right? You had those who were really engaged in Scripture and focused on kind of the healing power of Scripture and words, and those that were had the roots, but then engaged in what they perceived as being more practical socioeconomic development. But it was, I would say, in the way that they talked and discussed. I mean, there's this one moment, and this is not necessarily related to peace building, but, we were sitting in a truck and we were about to head out from Jos when we were going to Gombe, and we just sat there and we prayed for about a good 10 minutes, and, we asked God to ensure that we had a safe journey, and of course, because this is, car bombs happen every day there, so it's a reality, and you can definitely see how it was fascinating to see how this brought up people's practice of religion and everyday experiences. So it was prevalent wherever you went. It wasn't just about peace building, but it was really entrenched within the society. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah.
Great. All right. We have a question from Megan Lester asking, beyond supporting the church on the ground in Nigeria, are there things we can encourage church members to do or support here in the USA that can have positive ripple effects for Nigeria?
Nate, do you want to tackle that one first?
Sure, I'll start. Oh, Kate seems to have gone. So I see that Megan is from Lancaster, and so she might be aware of some of the stuff that was happening already. Through our office, we have worked with some petitions from churches to help raise awareness, particularly in the DC policy context. I've spent a fair amount of time talking with Kate and working with her. We're starting to convene a working group here in DC around different non-governmental organizations and church organizations and academics who will be doing advocacy around policy and recommendations for a range of different pieces. We're actually hoping to meet in the next week or so to discuss sort of how we respond now post the elections that were a few weeks ago. So there are, at this point, I would say, stay alert and connect maybe to our office, and as things come up where we need people or churches to speak out on particular policy issues or raising particular support, I think that would be a critical piece, but there's not a specific component, a specific action at this very moment that we have sort of lined up, but we're hoping to move into that more actively. But also, there's a women's choir from the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria will be traveling around this summer, and so those sort of things are raising awareness. I'm going to be speaking at a church that's having a sort of cultural fair, and some of this is to raise money, some of it's to raise awareness, build ecumenical and interfaith partnerships sort of in our local community so that we are more ready to work on building peace here, but also to support people in that context.
Hi, sorry, I'm still here.
Great.
I got kicked off, but I'm back on. I would just reiterate Nate's. Sorry, I have a bit of a. Hello?
Yeah, you're still there.
Sorry. Just to reiterate Nate's point in that I think at this moment, there's not a lot of policy actions that we can take here in the U.S. I think we're at a weird standstill now that Buhari has been elected but isn't in office. It'll depend a lot on his responses, on his response to some of the issues of corruption and ineffective governance that have kind of exacerbated the Boko Haram crisis, especially as it relates to abusive military and police forces, as well as some of the issues related to governance. So I think, at the moment, there's nothing that I can think of, but I'm sure this could change at any moment, really, and I'm sure that Nate would be willing to share those updates when they do happen. But it's just, we're going by kind of a day-to-day response, I think, at this point, and there's just been a lot of military action right now, and there's not a clear picture of the situation on the ground. That I know of. I don't know, maybe Nate would know better. But as I understand it, this will probably change within the next month or two when Buhari ascends to power, which I think it's May 29th. But yeah, so that would be my take on what you could do. But I would definitely wait and listen for updates from Church of Brethren.
I'll add one extra piece to that, since I'm seeing other questions at the moment. One thing that to me feels fairly critical is on the sort of local and essentially broader education, even potentially with your members of Congress, about sort of the broad nature of the ongoing pieces of the conflict. Kate gave a fairly wide-ranging overview of things that contribute to all these different sort of difficulties. And so, for example, I was at a press release of a congresswoman a few weeks ago, and it was around the anniversary of the kidnapping of the Chibok girls. And while this is obviously very, very bad, and we're very concerned about this, I often had the impression that people heard that happen and they kind of thought it was out of the blue and nothing else is happening. So if we just, if the girls were just brought back, then everything would be set and, everything would be perfect. And so I think also sort of in the interim time, continuing to let people know that this is they're ongoing struggles, that, even if the girls would sort of miraculously come back right now, there's trauma healing that would be needed. There would be sort of long-term economic development and all these, environmental restoration. And these pieces are not isolated sort of instances, but they're many and connected. So having that in our minds when we think about this is I believe, a critical component that's often lacking.
Yeah, I would concur with that, and I think it's something that is critical, is this understanding of the more holistic problem, and to see kind of our response, which has been quite militaristic. Currently the Congress is training and equipping, troops in Cameroon, in Niger, and Chad, but we haven't done Nigeria, mostly because human rights violations were where they went and indiscriminately killed Muslim men, fearing that they were Boko Haram, and this, of course, created almost new grievances. And so the American government really has kind of clamped down on our military aid and police aid to Nigeria until they kind of reform their security sector. But I think what our organizations would be very fearful of is that we're basically taking the same model that didn't work in Nigeria and we're putting it in Chad and Cameroon and Niger and asking them, who also suffer, these security forces that also suffer from human rights violations, to fight Boko Haram. And so I fear that we're kind of heading down this trajectory where we're cutting the head off the snake, but they're going to eventually just go back underground and become more violent and more radicalized, which they did in 2009 when we captured their leader, Muhammad Yusuf, and their security forces executed him without, jury or trial. And so I think that this Haram has proved to be an extremely resilient and dynamic group that can, fade back into the landscape and into the bush only to resurface more violent and more radical. And so I think a big piece of this is understanding and appreciating that the military response hasn't worked, and we need to kind of come up with better ways of supporting and identifying peace builders on the ground that are on the front lines of countering violent extremism. And I think that's kind of this meta-level conversation where we talk about the prioritization of funding for, the different foreign policy arms and agencies that we have here in the U.S. government, whether it be state or USAID or Department of Defense, and the fact that the Department of Defense acquires and garners the majority of resources and funding kind of translate to how we interact and provide support throughout the world. And we've given a lot of support to militaries that do suffer from, as an attempt to kind of create a proxy military that suffer from these human rights abuses. And we haven't done enough to really support local entities that can actually do the socioeconomic development, actually mitigate violence, that can actually talk to these young men that are being funneled into Boko Haram recruitment funnels. So I think this is a larger kind of question too, and things that we need to talk about with Congress and asking, how is our projection of our own federal agencies and where we support and put emphasis on, where we're giving the majority of these resources to the military, therefore we rely on them for the solutions, and they aren't necessarily always the right tool. So I think, just to add to Nate's comments is all.
All right, thank you both so much for those thoughts. Right. Since it doesn't look like we're having any more questions right now, we can go ahead and say thank you to Nate and Kate for their insights that they shared. We've got another question, so we'll go ahead and let that happen. So this one is for you, Kate. Yeah. From Thomas Crago. Could Kate describe the 33 million IDPs in Nigeria a bit more? That number seems very high. We have heard of perhaps 4 million in the Northeast, but nothing close to 33 million.
Yeah, I would be happy to, Thomas. Thank you for the question. So the 33 million IDPs is a number attributed by the International Refugee Council, the IRC report, that tracks the progression of IDPs. And what is so shocking with the number within Nigeria is that a lot of these IDPs are actually hidden. They often don't end up in camps or kind of installation sites for migrating IDPs, but they end up with family members, friends, communities absorb this kind of, and within Nigeria, there's no attempt to really kind of calculate or account for these people. This is all done by kind of international groups that monitor IDP migrations. So they came up with about, the number is 33.3 million. This is consecutive, right? Like, this is continuous. This isn't just from like a single event, such as the crisis in the Northeast. And a lot of these actually are from floods and not so much conflict. And I don't know if you saw the report, but I think it's 10 times worldwide, 10 times the amount of people are displaced by climate-induced effects than conflicts itself worldwide. So it's not that obviously conflict is an extremely important aspect and they both feed into each other, but the larger amount of IDPs are actually coming from flooding and different natural disasters that we're seeing an increasing occurrence of because of climate change. Did that answer your question, Thomas?
I'm gonna assume that was a good answer for him. Since nothing else has come in, I'll say that we can go ahead and finish up here. So thank you so much, Nate and Kate, for what you have shared. It's a very timely discussion right now. If I can get my computer to agree with me, I will put up a slide in just a minute with my contact information so that you can be in touch with me about receiving continuing education units but also if you have any questions, I can forward those along to Nate or to Kate accordingly. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thanks.
Thank you.